Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming today to the ICS and to our annual, or not our 2024 Trendall lecture. For those that don't know me, my name's Edwin Dodd. I'm a lecturer here in the Institute of Classical Studies, and it is truly delightful to see anyone familiar faces here and to welcome you all on behalf of the ICS. It gives me great pleasure to say that we have Professor Roman Rolfe here with us today to speak. And of course, Roman is our Trendall Fellow for 2024 here at the ICS. Before I introduce Roman and speak briefly about where he's coming from, what he's doing, and hopefully what he's speaking about today, two brief logistical notes. First, as always, please ensure that your phones are put on silent so we can avoid any disturbances and actually enjoy all the amazing things that Roman is going to speak about. And second, of course, we'll have some time for questions following the lecture, and after any questions, we can head up to the back where Valerie has kindly put on a nice little selection of drinks, including Prosecco. We're feeling very, very special today. So it gives me, as I said, great pleasure to introduce Roman today. He's, of course, well known to many of us here in the room, especially for his work on Roman expansion, socio-cultural change, work incorporating text material like ceramics, iconography, and so on. Stretching all the way from the early mid-Republic through the Empire. Roman is, of course, now a professor at the University of Cape Town, but undertook degrees and held various posts at Cambridge, along with visiting positions at places like Cologne, including Humboldt Fellowship. While he is here with us at the ICS as Trendall Fellow, Roman is currently, I believe, working on his next book, which is entitled The First Roman Empire, Frontiers and Foundations and the Transformation of Italy, from which I believe this lecture draws, so I'm sure Roman will tell us much more in due course. And I think it just leaves me to say that I very much look forward to hearing what Roman's speaking about today, coming out of several visiting fellowships that he's held over recent months, looking at the period of the 2nd century BCE between mid-Republic and Principate, especially as one formative for this regional Italian culture, or cultures, I should say, that we see developing. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Roman as our ICS AD Trendall Fellow for 2024 with the paper entitled Regionalism and Empire, Italy in the 2nd century BCE. Roman, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Edwin. Very kind words, and it's a great pleasure to be here as a Trendall Fellow. It's a really a great honour to have been awarded this fellowship, and I'm very actually enjoying my time here and benefiting from the library and just discussing things with colleagues here. So it's great to be back in London, actually. It's been a while. I'll sit down, that's okay. So, during the final quarter of the 2nd century, a remarkable project of monumental construction took place in the later city of Praeneste to the southeast of Rome, one of only few communities in the region that had retained its independence in 338 BCE. Sponsored by rich citizens who had made their fortunes in the Mediterranean trade, and we know them from inscriptions, trade which had exponentially increased as a result of Rome's Mediterranean conquests, in which Praenestine contingents had notably participated, the time-honored sanctuary of Fortuna Primigenia was transformed on a monumental scale. On the surface of it, the construction of monumental buildings using the proceeds of imperial endeavors is not itself exceptional, and those familiar with classical Athens, or in fact the gigantic projects of some of the Hellenistic kings, may be relatively unimpressed by the Praenestine's project, which in fact still dominates the townscape of Palestrina to this day. Yet the monumental construction of Fortuna's temple, the locus of the famous sortes, that was frequented in Cicero's day and still familiar to Valerius Maximus' Tiberian readers, deserves our undivided attention in this context of my lecture's topic for at least two reasons. First, it was a truly local affair, and in this respect fits in with numerous building projects that were undertaken by Italian towns whose citizens had found wealth as a result of participating in empire, be it as negotiatores, somewhere in what they also considered their mare nostrum, or closer to home, as traders, ship owners, or indeed landowners who were involved in the lucrative production of oil and wine for the Mediterranean markets. The second reason why the Praenestine construction project of the late 2nd century should interest us here concerns the way in which it was built, or rather, the principal material that was used and the construction techniques which engineers and builders employed in creating the goddess's building. For the construction of Fortuna's temple represented a tour de force of innovation. As Marcello Borgetta has been able to show, beyond reasonable doubt, concrete construction had been invented only a few decades earlier, and certainly not before the middle of the 2nd century BCE. This emphatically goes against previously accepted views, such as that espoused by Filippo Corelli in PBSR some decades ago, according to whom concrete was not only a product of the immediate aftermath of the Second Punic War, but also of the Roman centre. By contrast, Borgetta has conclusively demonstrated both the later date of concrete and the fact that, rather than in metropolitan monuments, such as the basilicas mentioned in Livy's records of sensorial construction, the earliest uses of concrete took place in the region of Italy and initially in privately financed projects, such as the palatial houses of wealthy Pompeians, on which Borgetta has focused among other topics. Of course, what we now have to think about the basilica of the first half of the 2nd century BC is another question. But in addition to using a very new construction method on what may have been an unprecedented scale, the Praenestine engineers and builders were even more innovative. They decided against employing the trabeated construction technique, that is, the traditional timber-based approach to building that was still followed in most concrete buildings, and instead created a series of vaulted terraces on several levels, seen here very nicely in this reconstruction, which additionally heightened the sanctuary's dominance within both the town and the landscape surrounding it. In terms of scale, innovative use of technology, and in fact speed of construction, the sanctuary of Fortuna thus represented a remarkable achievement. The case of concrete is illustrative of a wider historical phenomenon that forms the subject of my lecture, in which I will be approaching today across a wide range of evidence that is not usually discussed in the same context, and therefore my disclaimer at this point. My reason for this unorthodox choice is that what I presented to you today is in fact taken from 2 draft chapters of a forthcoming monograph, which Emlyn referred to, on Rome's Italian Empire, which these 2 chapters focus on different kinds of evidence for socio-political institutions and also material culture as evidence for regional history, respectively. Yet, in order to accommodate the, I suppose, diverse interests of the audience, but also, and in particular, to discuss some of the broader conclusions, which I reach about the 2nd century in the book, it has seemed appropriate somewhat to disregard conventional disciplinary boundaries for present purposes, and I think also take into account then all disadvantages that this might have in terms of my conclusion for today. As Borgetta has argued on the basis of his findings in respect of concrete, and having other scholars have responded to his work since, the later part of the 2nd century BCE constitutes a crucial yet late phase for the emergence of Roman material culture. In broad agreement with this view, I would also consider the transformation of Italian material culture into notably Roman forms for another type of material that is equally emblematic of Roman culture at this time, and which, in fact, was not all that far removed from the lives of those who paid for the construction of Fortuna's sanctuary at Praeneste, and who sponsored concrete constructions on a more or less monumental scale in their hometowns and regions. Most of the known ones here clearly are actually in Latium and also Campania, also elsewhere. These artifacts, which I'll be talking about, are the clay amphoras that were used to ship Italian produce across the Mediterranean, and which underwent a remarkable, yet largely unnoticed transformation from around the year 150 BCE. Of course, it's possible to date precisely. Like concrete construction, these amphoras were also regional products, and I will show how their morphological transformation points to distinctly regional dynamics within the context of the Mediterranean that was militarily and politically dominated by the Roman Republic, and which was beginning to display globalizing trends. In the second part of my lecture, I extend my discussion of cultural transformation in 2nd century Italy to a range of evidence that will particularly be familiar to ancient historians in the audience. These are our sources, literary in part, but also but primarily epigraphic in nature, for changes at the level of socio-political institutions and language use. And it is in this context that we will then encounter the gentleman who is shown on the poster advertising his lecture, and that's the Abendatore from Lake Trasimene. My intended outcome of this lecture is to show how such a broadly conceived approach to our evidence not only improves our understanding of the origins of the regionalized nature of Republican and early imperial Italy, but also helps resolve the impasse that exists among historians in respect of how culturally integrated Italy was before the social war. Yet before turning to discussing the material evidence in more detail, it is necessary to provide some context to the 2nd century BC, and specifically to summarize in briefest ways my approach to the preceding period of Rome's conquest of Italy. By way of necessity, this historical backdrop is required, in however schematized form, this is very schematic here, to understand the scale of the transformation which followed in the 2nd century BCE. The Roman conquest of Italy was in many ways more than the term implies, nor was it primarily a series of military events, even if this has been the focus of many studies. By contrast, processes summed up under the heading of conquest involved an ordering or rather a relayering of settlement structures, hierarchies, and in general social relations, and of course political relations. These processes involve formal colonization and the physical, sometimes enforced movement of people. Yet the gradual, and in many cases piecemeal expansion of socio-economic and political networks were equally important aspects. At the same time, we must bear in mind that the conquest of Italy, as defined here, happened gradually and over the space of more than 150 years. Therefore, resultant structures were necessarily heterogeneous. For example, the nature of Roman colonization changed quite significantly between the early 4th century and the late 3rd century BCE. Thus, a plausible case has been made, particularly by Michael Crawford and Ed Bispham, that our sources need distinction between Latin and citizen colonies may not be older than the early 2nd century BCE. Incidentally, of course, this is a case which I could have discussed here as well, but which I've chosen not to refer to in any more detail. In addition, many features of urban planning and construction that are usually associated with colonization were not present before then either. As we have already seen, in fact, great urban projects that are so emblematic of Republican culture do not precede, in any known case, the second half of the 2nd century BCE. So it seems
well, judging by what we know at the moment, that the Latin colonies before the 2nd century BC were relatively empty spaces. Some houses, usually a temple certainly, but any of the other civic structures which we associated with them were not really present. So that's actually quite an interesting discovery, or rather discovery of absence over the last couple of decades. By the same token, the Roman alliance system is, in its formalized form, unlikely to predate the year 225 BCE, for which Polybius, famously based on an account of famous Pictor, preserves the recruitment figures from the eve of the Gallic War. Rather, Rome's alliances during the period of the Italian conquests were much looser, and more importantly, greatly dependent on the agency of allied elites. While Rome was by and large able to hold the overall initiative in warfare and its concomitant phenomena, her control over the allies was ultimately limited, as shown by the example of the Legio Campana at Reggio in the years leading up to the First Punic War. Conversely, the dissatisfaction of the Capuans in 216 BCE was based precisely on the loss of that freedom of action which they had previously enjoyed during the period of the Italian conquest. In this way, it was only during the last 4 decades of the 3rd century BCE that Rome's hegemony in Italy was starting to become formalized. To a great extent, responsible for this was the very fact that the conquest of Italy came to an end during these years. The last military campaign in Italy before Fregellae in 125 BCE, leaving aside the problems of Bruttium during the early 2nd century BCE, had been the war against Falerii in 241 BC, the year which also saw the establishment of the last 2 tribes. Of course, we have no means of knowing whether or not these 2 tribus were intended to be the last ones to be created. However, what matters is the fact that no new tribus were subsequently added, and the interrelationship between tribus and centuria had already been reformed beyond the point of return by the time of famous Maximus Victorius' electoral intervention in 215 BCE. With expansion now happening outside Italia into the western Mediterranean and Cisalpine Gaul, we agree with Filippo Calaguenc, who claims that North Italy was part of Italia from effectively the early 3rd century BCE. More warfare in the peninsula was undesirable, potentially destructive. The overreaction shown by Rome in the Faliscan War, with 2 consular armies being sent against a relatively small town, in fact, exemplifies this destructive potential and also its risks. With the First Punic War having come to an end in the previous year, War of Falerii arguably represented to the consuls the only way in which they might be able to earn their triumphs. In the long run, however, such adventures within Italy have the dangerous potential to destabilize the region, or the macro region. Thus, the structure of Italy was a complex beast at the beginning of the 2nd century BCE. On the one hand, the myriad communities, hierarchies, and inter-elite connections were the result of the conquest of Italy during the preceding period. On the other hand, the frontier dynamics that had produced such a culturally layered landscape had now come to an end. Viewed from a perspective akin to the new historical institutionalism, in fact, one could see the creation of the last 2 tribus in 241 BC and the subsequent tribal reforms as shaping a path of dependence towards greater structural cohesion in Italy in cultural and political terms. In addition, the experiences and outcomes of the Hellenic War played an important role, which, however, we should be careful not to rank as the single most important factor shaping the subsequent history of Italy. Yet what we can certainly identify were a formalization and a hierarchical distancing in Rome's relationship with her Italian allies. At the same time, the shared history of the Roman conquest, and in particular, the tangible consequences of Rome's hegemony, infrastructure, but also the very active Italian participation in the conquest, trade, enslavement always has to be mentioned, placed 2nd century Italy at the center of a Mediterranean macro region of which Romans and allies alike considered themselves to be masters. This complex provides the setting for what I'm discussing today, and as we shall see, is equally relevant for both the traditionally archaeological and the conventionally historical case studies to which I'm now turning. Sorry, again, talk about from Germany recently. I didn't change the part of the title. Sorry. So, in the case of concrete, Roman culture, as Morgetta defines it there, took the form of an entirely new material, hadn't existed before, that was used both for traditional purposes of construction, regular houses, but also enabled Roman architects, builders, and engineers to engage with the transforming world around them in an entirely novel fashion, as seen as prinesty. The case of amphoras is a little different, in that the category of vessel to transport agricultural produce in bulk had been in existence in the Mediterranean for over 2 millennia, and been known in Italy certainly since at least the Orientalizing period. So it's not that new. Yet the amphoras, which were in use in central Italy, central and South Italy, notably in Campania, since the 4th century BCE, and in Sicily, even before then, had not fundamentally changed and were really quite uniform. Some sort of regional differences within Campania might arguably be seen. However, the very fact that a widely accepted typology for this type of container, known as the Greco-Italic amphora, was established only recently reflects this relative uniformity. So there's still quite some debate over the morphological change in these amphorae, particularly between the 3rd and the 2nd century BCE. So this is an old, Italian transport vessel from the Hellenistic period, originating in Greece, Sicily, and then being produced primarily in Campania, with the best studies really done for Ischia up to now. The primary use of the Greco-Italic amphoras was to contain and transport wine, although the importance of secondary and tertiary functions of amphoras is increasingly being recognized. So it could have been used for something else afterwards, for storage of other foodstuffs, or for transport of goods. Also in construction, amphoras were used as lightning elements in vaults, etc. At any rate, I'm not going to talk about wine very much, because the increasing importance of these containers is proxy evidence for the study of the economy, and particularly for wine production and trade, thanks to the cutting-edge research of eminent and his colleagues, provides us with a welcome opportunity to focus on them as examples of material culture instead. So we are increasingly less dependent on amphorae when it comes to wine trade, the oil trade, simply because we now know a lot more about oil production, particularly wine production, in the regions of the Mediterranean, especially Italy. And interestingly, that does not always play up with the amphora evidence, and doesn't often play up with the information presented to us by literary sources either. But I will be talking about that today. Back to the amphoras themselves. From the middle of the 2nd century BCE, the final incarnation of the Greco-Italic amphora, so the transitional types, very short-lived transitional type, rapidly transformed into the first, what I would call the first Roman amphoras. Previously, these were not Roman amphoras, these have been around throughout the Hellenistic period. And most of you will have seen this before. It's the most familiar to anyone who's ever worked, particularly in the Tyrrhenian side of Italy. So, the plural amphora types is important here. Because in contrast to the ubiquitously used, yet primarily Campanian, and later also South Etruscan Greco-Italics, the first Roman amphoras were firmly regionalized in their production, and to an important extent also in the distribution. On the Tyrrhenian side of the peninsula, the well-known type, known as Dressel I, emerges, traded widely in the western and central Mediterranean, particularly along the coast of Gaul, also Spain, everywhere in Italy. So it's really, and produced, we have some production sites, famous of course near the Albania estuary. So yeah, these were produced there, traded very, very widely, presumably for the Campanian and Etruscan wine. However, on the Adriatic side of Italy, especially northwards from Ancona and including the Veneto, the Laboria II shape developed. This is much less known. This type, lesser known, not because of the quantities that were produced and found, but on account of lagging publication, is particularly interesting for present purposes. The Laboria II amphora is widely found on sites of the eastern Mediterranean, which includes a large concentration at Alexandria, interestingly, where very few Dressel I amphoras have been found. What has, to my knowledge, not been remarked upon so far is that this novel, regional Italian type of material culture morphologically engaged with the Greek types of wine amphora, which had been widely distributed in the East Mediterranean, and which also found their way to the east coast of Italy throughout the Hellenistic period. Interestingly, so these are Cnidian, Coan, Rhodian amphoras. Interestingly, the Laboria II amphora is not an imitation of any specific type. This is worth noting, since such copies were very widespread in the East Mediterranean during this period and have been studied in detail by Martin Laval and others. By contrast, the Laboria II amphora is a distinctly Roman amphora that, however, mimicked rather than imitated the paunchy shapes that are known, or rather common to most Greek wine amphoras of the period. Fits quite nicely then in this East Mediterranean context, while retaining its sort of, its distinctly Roman type. Now, although the distribution of this type of amphora was widespread, notable concentrations have been identified in the principal centers of Italian negotiatores in the east, such as Athens, Delos, and Ephesus. It's not to say that not elsewhere. Of course, those sites affect the privilege of publication as well. But it's quite clear that the sites of the sort of emporia of Romaioi were particularly full of these and the map is sort of helpful. It's Adam Lindhar's publication in JRA 2009. It shows quite nicely here. They are also found on the West Mediterranean, but the bulk of production really is the Eastern Mediterranean, with a strong concentration in Alexandria as well. Ephesus, there is more, but these have just been reported upon. They've not been all published. It's the problem, really. We also see Sicily as actually interested in this period. Is always sort of a point in between. We actually have, it's the only place we sort of have a mix of both worlds in a sense. So Delos was particularly well studied, and Delos also provides us here with a particularly interesting context of Lamborghia II amphoras. In this context here are the storage facilities which have been excavated in this area here, the Agora of the Capitalia, shown here, and where some storerooms, which were obviously associated with consumption, have been found. Interestingly, the contents of these amphoras appears to have been used locally, certainly judging by the unusual frequency of original lids that were found in the same area. It's quite unusual. In addition, of course, Delos, of course, a bit difficult because of the context of destruction and desertion, so it's a bit odd in that case too. In addition to this, the finds themselves, one of the many wall paintings in this area, one of these wall paintings from the Agora shows such an amphora laid out as a prize in a wrestling match. That is, Claire Azador has proposed, form part of the new Capitali key. This invites a suggestion that this represents one of the ritualized, distinctly Roman pastimes of the Italian negotiatores who frequented the Capitalia, and we know they came from different parts of Italy, as Saskia and also others have shown. These merchants were, of course, a diverse group who hailed from different parts of Italy, but I always have to add, of course, that in the Greek East they were called the Romaoi, with all the advantages and drawbacks which this held in store for them. And the presence of Lamborghia II amphoras, alongside Dressel I, the first Roman amphora type, thus made the interactions in the Capitalia a distinctly Roman context, perhaps even more specifically a Roman context involving Romaoi in the Greek East. Now, I could say more about amphoras, but especially since ceramic containers that were used to transport oil started to behave along similar lines in 140s BCE. Again, the east coast of Italy is precocious in this respect, notably the ovoid amphoras produced at Apani near Brundisium are worthy of note. They also bear nice inscriptions. In addition, there is intriguing evidence to suggest that the territory of Fregellae, with the old citizen colony at Mentoni as its emporium, had become a regional hub for production and export of olive oil in the years leading up to the destruction of the city in 125 BCE. However, within the temporal and thematic constraints of this lecture, which I don't want to just make one up for us, I think it's the example of Lamborghia II has now provided you with a good idea of sort of how a Roman material culture emerged in the area of transport ceramics from the years around 150 BCE too. Additionally worth noting in this respect is the qualitative difference between the new Roman amphoras and their Greco-Italic predecessors. Roman amphoras are much more interesting, or perhaps put it less flippantly. They are much more diverse in their standardized way. As in the case of concrete, these new Roman types of material culture emerged in a regional context, much as terra sigillata, or to stay with transport containers, the practice to move wine to gore in sealed dolia did in Latin Latium and Etruria during the following century. In the next part of the lecture, I demonstrate that this principle of a standardized diversity can also be observed at other levels of our evidence and, in fact, of historical action. The first of these concerns the question of language use, or rather how widely spoken Latin was becoming in Italy over the course of the 2nd century BCE. So literary references to language use in Italy during the 2nd century or at any other time are predictably rare. Very few. Maybe something like Etruscans earlier, at the end of the 4th century, then here's this passage. It's an odd passage here. Now, when these mentions occur, therefore, much is usually made of them, and this certainly applies to a somewhat obscure sentence that is tagged at the end of chapter 42 in Livy's 40th book. So in 180 BC, the town of Cumae sent a delegation to Rome, charged with requesting the right to use Latin in public assemblies and auctions. This passage is often cited to support one of the more problematic concepts of the history of the Roman Republic, and of the 2nd century in particular, namely the idea of self-Romanization. According to this line of argument, the Cumans were gradually transforming themselves into citizens from their status as cives sinusfragio, to which the public use of Latin was an essential ingredient. Now, as we know from Henry Burris's study of this, and with which I agree, this of course is highly problematic. Not only is this interpretation based on a historically improbable view of what a civitas sinusfragio might have been, but it also invokes the idea that by the end of the 2nd century, the obscure category of this bizarre citizenship, probably more than one category, gradually disappeared by way of self-assimilation into the full citizenship. At any rate, the lack of any additional information beyond this isolated sentence, which Livy might have found in the text of an analyst who was particularly interested in Cumae, means that such specific explanations are no more than speculations. On the other hand, what the passage plausibly tells us is that Latin was increasingly used across Italy in public and commercial contexts. Certainly by members of the elites, some of whom might even have been negotiatores or something like that, but probably also by people outside it who had served in the army or conducted business with Latin speakers. The fact that the case ended up at Rome, presumably before the Senate, might furthermore indicate that there had been some kind of debate among members of the human elite as to whether or not such a use should officially be enshrined. The Romans probably couldn't care less. And it is also possible that such arguments were not unknown in other Italian communities either. In the specific case of Cumae, one might add that Latin could have become commonly spoken in this part of Campania since the foundation of the Roman citizen colony Neva Coccioli in the 190s BCE, but this is probably all we can say about this passage. Here, the general question of the use of Latin by 2nd century Italians may well be naive. As even Livy's isolated sentence about Cumae demonstrates, what mattered were the contexts in which certain languages were spoken. Public affairs in this case, or, as we shall see, the way in which concepts that were usually expressed in Latin affected the usage of other languages. Here we need to turn to epigraphic evidence and specifically to engage with the terminologies that were used for political institutions. As a second step, it is also worth considering the physical, that is, material and visual aspects of inscriptions. I'm just discussing very few sort of select obvious examples, with no claim to be in any way exhaustive. But before we look at these examples, it's worth restating an important fact, or several facts rather, about 2nd century inscriptions in Italy. First, in general, inscriptions in languages other than Latin are frequent, certainly more frequent than those in Latin before the second half of the period. Second, and with a partial exception of Etruscan, lengthy inscriptions in languages other than Latin are primarily a 2nd century phenomenon. In the specific case of Sanda inscriptions, and incidentally of monumental sanctuaries in Sandin altogether, as Tessa's deck has shown, and as Claudia Vida is about to show in her new book, these inscriptions were in fact entirely a 2nd and early 1st century phenomenon, so no Sanda inscription before. Perhaps reaching back to the last decade of the 3rd century, depending on how one wishes to date the difficult but interesting Tavola d'Agnone. The reason for this is, of course, not that those languages had not previously been spoken. Rather, we shall see that the emergence of in particular, Oscan inscriptions can be conclusively placed in the context of the emergence of shared cultural and socio-political structures in Italy, which were in place well before the municipal system rose from the ashes of the social war. And as with regard to material culture, the fact that the Italians were at the center of the imperial project plays an important role here too. Put more crudely, because Italian states had to, and also by and large, wanted to participate in and benefit from imperial expansion within a framework dominated by Rome, they developed institutional structures that corresponded to those of the hegemon. The case is particularly obvious in respect of the censorship, which, contrary to a recent claim, was by no means an ancient Etruscan or Italic institution. The requirements placed on the allies by the recruitment system rendered the creation of such magistracies both necessary and desirable, since it guaranteed a modicum of control over a state's own resources, in contrast program being provided by the 12 colonies. But other institutional equivalences greatly facilitated interacting with Rome and with neighboring communities of Roman citizens, as well as with other Italian states. As we shall see in the case of the Lex Oscar, furthermore, this could go as far as the adoption or at least adaptation of entire Roman statutes. Therefore, the examples of public inscriptions in Oscan, which I presently discussed, are Roman in the sense of institutional and cultural history. While there are strong statements of local and regional practices and belonging, in the sense in which Cicero was to use the term patria a century later, these inscriptions are not in any way the last remnants of pre-Roman cultures that were about to disappear. They are part of this Roman culture. The treaty between Abella and Nola that is recorded on the Sippus Abellanis provides us with a case of a boundary dispute between two neighboring communities in Campania, of the kind that was caricatured by an anecdote dismissed by Cicero about Quintus Fabius Labeo intervening in a dispute between Naples and Nola in around the same time. These were precisely the types of issues which Italian states were expected to and presumably wanted to sort out between themselves, meaning that corresponding political institutions and concepts of law were helpful. Thus, the inscription lists several corresponding offices and institutions in the two Campanian cities, which in their nomenclature and function mirrored the structures of the Roman hegemon. We encounter legatuis, legates, senatis, senates, and quaesturi, and quaestors, that are in turn referred to collectively as medices, which, as James Claxton and Geoffrey Horrocks suggest, corresponded to the Latin magistratus. This too clearly represents not only a new usage of an old terminology, but moreover points to the adaptation of a Roman institutional collective concept. This pattern finds parallels in other public inscriptions in Oscan from the 2nd century. Of particular interest is a text from the Pompeian Palaestra, shown on the next slide there. In addition to naming the office of quaestor, this also attests to a specialization in the meaning of certain existing words and phrases in order to convey specific institutional processes in close correspondence to their Roman equivalents. To cite Horace and Claxton, the phrase convenies tangulit is equivalent to the Latin formula de senatus sententia, and it may show the same specialization in meaning of the noun tangulit from thought to decision, which Latin sententia underwent, end quote. We are dealing with a Roman context here, and both what the inscription states and how it does it are far removed from what would likely to be found in a hypothetical equivalent inscription of the 4th or 3rd century BCE. Now, any discussion of Oscan inscriptions in relation to the development of institutions would, of course, be incomplete without at least briefly touching, no more time for that, upon the Oscan law on the Tabula Bantina. So that's the geographical context there in the area of Venosa Venusia in Lithuania. As most of you will know, this document is particularly useful since it demonstrates how the emergence of a Roman culture in the second century Italy also created room for resistance from within this complex. Inscribed in the years leading up to the Social War, or as Elia Locascio has recently suggested at the very beginning of the conflict, Caesarea, there was actually preparation for the recruitment of soldiers used against Rome. At any rate, since somewhere in the very early 1st century, this law set out a statute for the community of Bantia in the southeast of Italy, not far from the Latin colony of Venusia, in a region that had notably been very badly affected by the land crises of the 130s and 120s BCE, particularly unhappy with Rome for this and other reasons. The text mentions several magistracies, such as praetors, censors, quaestors. It sets out rules for the summoning of assemblies and penalties for those who try to evade the census and thus military service, which would make eminent sense in the context of major war. But it was a major war, as Diodorus reminds us. As Michael Crawford has furthermore shown, the statute closely resembles those we know from Latin colonies. It's even written in Latin. Normally Greek would have been used for Oscan in this area. And it's even possible, the immaterial here, that the Lex Oscar closely adapted or even copied the laws of Venusia. The Lex was written in Oscan. However, in the Latin alphabet, clearly by people who were used to doing their official business in Latin, as several mistakes and retranslations appear to prove. Perhaps the town's elite had even been divided over the use of Latin at some point during the 2nd century, as we saw might have been the case with Cumae. We don't know this. At any rate, the deliberate use of Oscan inscribed on the reverse of a Latin law, as well as the specific historical context of the document, make an example of regional resistance. Yet this resistance expresses itself through an effort to approach institutional symmetry to the hegemon. Yes, the Oscan language is used as a deliberate statement, but in a context and form that decidedly belongs into Roman Italy of the late 2nd or very early 1st century BCE. The use of an inscribed statute, and thus of a form of institutional communication and physical representation that was recognizably Roman, made it unmistakably clear that we are not dealing here with a Lucanian community of the pre-Roman period, or with a sense of some sort of dying identity, but with a regional polity that was not only conditioned by the nature of Rome's hegemony, but that also defined itself in terms of Roman institutions, and mobilized its troops in this way too. And what we know about the rebel state Italia, of course, also conforms to the same model, both about its constitution and from the iconography of its coinage. This was well placed. However, rather than drifting off into discussion of the social war, which I'm really trying to avoid here, let me return to the final and indeed concluding example that builds a bridge between material culture and text. Now, sometime during the last quarter of the 2nd century BCE, I'm happy to discuss the dating of the statue. The people of Perusia, or possibly Cortona, voted that a statue of Aula Vitelle, presumably a leading citizen of the town, be set up in a public place as a gift to the deity's sons. Discovered somewhere, and this somewhere is important, near Lake Trasimene in 1566. And this is important because, so that's why I said we don't know whether it refers to the ancient settlement of Cortona or Perusia, because it was found, and because the Florentines wanted to keep it, it was claimed that it was found in Florentine as opposed to papal territory. So that's different. So found in 1566 and now on display in the National Museum of Florence. So the Medicis were successful in acquiring it. This so-called Arignatura, for its gesture, forms a rare surviving example of full-scale bronze sculpture from the Republican period, and it's deserving of our interest for this reason alone. Yet, what matters even more for present purposes is the way in which this leading citizens of a North Etruscan city-state was represented in this instance. I'm pointing to an article by Klaus Fiction here. We discussed this in great detail, but ends up with the wrong conclusion for the date. Which is quite an interesting debate. No one really agrees with that. For the statue, in fact, shows in considerable detail a member of the Perusine or Cortonian aristocracy in what one could easily mistake for a Roman senator addressing a consul, and I think that was originally the interpretation. In fact, the sculptor meticulously worked out specific details of the toga, which are most notable in respect of the embroidered and dyed border. The dye is shown with colored bronze, different alloy, of the garment, indicating senior rank, and of the senatorial sandals worn by the statue. It's not a great slide. I should have taken one of the plaster casts on it. In addition, the portrait of Aula Vitelle represents an outstanding example of the late Republican baristic style, which was otherwise known mostly through the medium of Roman marble copies. Yet the context of the sculpture is unmistakably Etruscan, as is shown both by the inscription on the hem of the sculpture, as shown here, and by the fact that the piece was dedicated to an Etruscan deity. In a more complex, yet at the same time less immediately obvious way, therefore, we are confronted here with dynamics that are comparable to those shown in other inscriptions. Thus, the Arignatura was both distinctly local and immediately recognizable as part of an increasingly globalizing culture that was in turn the product of Etruria and Italy's place within the empire dominated by Rome. Not unlike Pompeius Silo and his fellow rebel leaders, Aula Vitelle regarded himself and was viewed by his regional community as a holder of public office that was in turn conceptualized in correspondence to Roman institutions, which, one might add, had themselves emerged, at least to some extent, in the context of conquest and empire. Therefore, the Arignatura are now frustratingly singular, yet in the context of 2nd century towns in Italy, probably quite a typical piece of evidence. If we think of statues set up, for example, for leaders of allied regiments in their successful campaigns in war, which we know from military sources. This statue provides a fitting piece of evidence with which to conclude this lecture. This honorific sculpture bridges what is only a seemingly wide gap between the notional domains of cultural and socio-political, that is, in this case, institutional histories. In both areas, the 2nd century BCE saw the emergence in Italy and among Italians in the Mediterranean of a culture with globalizing traits that was at the same time regional in its articulations. Although it lacks historical specificity, the concept of globalization might provide an alternative heading under which to describe such a scenario encompassing historical action that range from pots to politics. The emergence of such new forms of cultural interaction across a range of material culture and institutional categories have deep roots in a shared historical trajectory on which Rome's rise to hegemony imprinted a considerable degree of path dependence. Now, one upshot of this is that Italy was culturally far more integrated before the 1st century BCE than recent studies such as the excellent book by Saskia Rosala have claimed. And I think that it's very important to appreciate the extent to which the Italians claimed ownership of the empire in this respect. She does discuss that very well. Monumental construction using concrete and the shipping of vast quantities of produce, standardized amphoras, across the entire Mediterranean were inconceivable outside the context of the empire which Rome and her allies had created. At the level of political institutions, the situation is rather more complex, of course. And there is no denying of the fact that the exclusion of most Italians from the Roman citizenship is an example of lacking political integration. This was certainly among the prime causes of the social war, just as it had brought about the early rebellion and subsequent destruction of Trendall, to which I alluded earlier. Yet at the same time, the institutional mirroring, or perhaps shadowing, referring completely to Thomas Barfield's new book about shadow empires, shadowing of Rome by local polities led to the remarkable expression of resistance, like those found in the Lex Oscar, or to borrow a term from Peter Brandt, the anti-pope-like nature of the rebel state Italia. This points to political integration at a conceptual level of institutions, which might in turn explain the relatively swift emergence of the municipal system after the social war, thus creating a regionalist Italy of Municipia whose origins lay in the early days of the 2nd century BC. Thank you very much.